Good evening. I'm William Chen, and what I'm about to share with you tonight is not speculation or theory. This is documented evidence of a government massacre and the international response that followed. 72 hours. That's how long it took for Iran to go from street protests to mass killings. More than 12,000 civilians are dead. The order came from the top, and in response, President Donald Trump authorized military action that hasn't been seen since the Iraq invasion of 2003. We've obtained leaked medical records, internal regime documents, flight tracking data, and military intelligence briefings. This is what they reveal. Stay with me. Let's start with the most disturbing aspect of this crisis. Not the geopolitics, not the military response, but the sheer number of dead bodies that now define the final days of the Islamic Republic. We've reviewed trauma reports leaked from emergency rooms in Tehran, Mashhad, Karaj, and Shiraz. What they show is a clear and horrifying pattern. The violence began with standard riot control: batons, tear gas, rubber bullets. But around 10 p.m. on January 8th, something changed. Surgeons working overnight shifts noticed it immediately. The injuries were different. Instead of bruises and welts, they were seeing catastrophic trauma. Shattered spines, deep chest wounds, headshots. This was live ammunition. Military-grade rounds. By midnight, the picture became clear. Riot police had been pulled back from the streets. In their place, specialized units from Iran's Revolutionary Guard had moved in, backed by Basij militias and a group identified only by a code name, Group 8210. These weren't crowd control officers. These were shock troops, and their orders were to eliminate resistance. One doctor we spoke to, who requested anonymity for obvious reasons, described the scene at a hospital in Karaj. Bodies were stacked in stairwells because there was no more room in the morgue. Triage zones collapsed under the volume of casualties. Medical supplies ran out within hours. Body bags ran out. And then the power went out. Deliberate state-ordered blackouts designed to hide what was happening inside. Over the next 48 hours, 12,000 civilians were killed. Not soldiers, not insurgents. Civilians. Mothers, students, bystanders, protesters. Under orders from Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the government initiated a total information blackout. Internet access was severed, satellite dishes were jammed, cell towers went dark, even ambulances were redirected away from certain districts, leaving the wounded to die in the streets. But the regime made one critical mistake. They didn't account for the doctors. Iranian medical staff began secretly documenting everything. They photographed wounds, recorded patient testimonies, copied death certificates. Then they smuggled that data out through encrypted VPN tunnels to international journalists and human rights organizations. That's how we know this wasn't chaos. This wasn't collateral damage from street violence spiraling out of control. This was planned. This was deliberate. This was domestic extermination, ordered from the top. So who gave that order? According to multiple intelligence assessments and documents leaked from within Iran's own security apparatus, the answer is unambiguous. Sources with access to Iran's Supreme National Security Council confirm that the decision to deploy Revolutionary Guard units with live military ammunition came directly from Ayatollah Khamenei's office. The order was transmitted through 3 separate branches of government, signed off by senior commanders, and delivered down the chain of command in writing. This wasn't rogue commanders acting on their own. This wasn't violence that got out of hand. This was authorized at the highest level of government. The leaked documents describe a coordinated operation designed to crush the uprising in a single weekend. Police forces were ordered to withdraw. Militias were mobilized. Revolutionary Guard units moved into city centers under cover of the national internet blackout. The objective was explicit: eliminate all resistance by force, and Washington was watching. U.S. intelligence satellites detected the movement of heavy military units into Tehran, Karaj, Mashhad, and Shiraz within hours of the blackout. Signals intelligence intercepted emergency communications between regional Manbunal, commanders requesting authorization for lethal engagement. That authorization was granted, and American analysts recorded it. By the morning of January 9th, U.S. intelligence had reached a conclusion. Iran's leadership had crossed a red line. This was no longer a protest crackdown. This was mass civilian extermination. That assessment was delivered directly to President Trump during a classified national security briefing. According to senior officials familiar with the meeting, the language was blunt. The killings were authorized. The orders were traced. Responsibility was identified. Trump's response was immediate. Within hours, he canceled all diplomatic engagement with Tehran and issued a public statement, not directed at the Iranian government broadly, but at its leadership specifically. His message was clear. We know what you did. We know who ordered it. And there will be consequences. When Trump later posted on social media urging Iranian patriots to document the names of those responsible for the killings, it wasn't just rhetoric. It was a signal. The United States now viewed the massacre as a command-level crime, not a riot gone wrong. The world had confirmation. Khamenei signed the order, and Trump knew it. While the world was still processing the news of the massacre, the United States was already moving assets into position. Civilian radar trackers and military analysts began picking up unusual activity across U.S. air bases in the Middle East. C-17 Globemaster cargo planes were lifting off from Ramstein Air Base in Germany, flying directly to Al Udeid in Qatar and Al Dhafra in the UAE, two of America's most strategically positioned bomber-capable airfields in the region. This wasn't routine. Analysts noted that the squadrons being deployed were specifically configured for rapid response and long-range strike missions. B-2 Spirit stealth bombers, F-15E Strike Eagles, aerial refueling tankers. In some cases, their transponders were switched off, standard protocol when the U.S. military wants to remain visible to allies, but invisible to adversaries. And while the Iranian regime was jamming internet signals, they couldn't jam satellites. U.S. reconnaissance was operating at full capacity. By the time news of the 12,000 civilian deaths broke publicly, targeting protocols had already been updated. Military commanders weren't debating whether to act. They were debating how. The deployment served a dual purpose: forward deterrence and tactical positioning. It sent a clear message to Tehran. We're not outside your reach. We're directly above it. On the ground, these movements were supported by cyber intelligence units activating across CENTCOM's Bahrain command hub. Defense contractors received 48-hour deployment notifications. Qatar's airfields received upgrades to nighttime sortie capabilities, a move that only happens when kinetic military intervention is under active consideration. And President Trump made sure the public knew. In a brief but loaded social media post, he wrote, "They will pay. Help is already in the air." No further explanation was needed, because by the time Iran tried to hide its crimes, American bombers were already in the sky. What happened in Tehran after the killings wasn't a return to order. It was the sound of a city holding its breath. As the Revolutionary Guard completed their sweep of protesters across key districts, Enqilab Avenue, Satarkhan, Azadi Square, Tehran didn't erupt in further rebellion. It collapsed into silence. Not because people gave up, but because so many were either dead, arrested, or in hiding. Residents described a quiet unlike anything they'd experienced before. No street vendors, no taxis, no voices. Just smoke lingering above charred storefronts and military trucks blocking major intersections as the regime tried to reassert control over a capital that no longer moved. Entire neighborhoods reported sudden evacuations. Families fled in the night. Those who stayed kept their lights off and their curtains closed. They weren't watching the news. They were waiting for the knock on the door. With the national internet severed for over 96 hours, Tehran had been cut off from the world. But the regime didn't account for Starlink. Across rooftops in northern Tehran, satellite dishes smuggled in by the Iranian diaspora glowed faintly in the dark, silently restoring communication to a city that had been digitally suffocated. Small videos began to leak out. Torn clothing hanging from balconies. Bullet holes in concrete walls. Empty funeral halls guarded by soldiers. Even funerals were banned. The regime tried to prevent grief from becoming protest. No chanting, no ceremonies, just secret burials and silence. This silence wasn't peace. It was something far more ominous. The regime believed it had reclaimed the capital. But inside Tehran, something fundamental had shifted. The state may have emptied the squares, but it could no longer fill them with loyalty. When the streets of a capital city go silent after a massacre, it's never calm. It's the sound of something breaking. Something that won't be fixed. While the world focused on chaos in Iran's streets, another operation was unfolding quietly above the headlines. Between December 27th and January 9th, flight trackers picked up a strange pattern. Russian Il-76 cargo planes, typically used for military logistics, were departing Tehran under civilian call signs. Their destination? Mineralny Vody, a remote but fortified airbase in southern Russia. These weren't diplomatic flights. These were heavy-lift operations designed for maximum cargo and minimal scrutiny. Intelligence analysts flagged the pattern immediately. The planes arrived in Iran empty and left fully loaded, flying over the Caucasus and avoiding all NATO airspace. This wasn't improvisation. This was a pre-planned exfiltration route. What was inside those planes? Leaked satellite imagery and runway reports suggest tons of gold, pallets of hard currency, and sensitive electronics. The claim, corroborated by Western intelligence and Iranian opposition sources, is that Ayatollah Khamenei's inner circle was moving Iran's last reserves out of the country, not for safekeeping, for themselves. As thousands were being killed in the streets, the regime's elite were flying out with the nation's wealth. British MP Tom Tugendhat and U.S. intelligence sources confirmed that this airlift resembled late-stage tactics used by Assad in Syria. Move valuables first, then leadership, then records. It was a copy-paste evacuation plan. And while the regime blasted anti-Western rhetoric on state television, their own families were reportedly applying for asylum in Europe. France, Germany, Austria. The very governments they called enemies were now their plan B. President Trump issued a chilling line: "Khamenei's not planning to stay, and we know where he's going." It was a direct reference to this escape route, because if a regime is killing its own people while flying its gold to Moscow, it's not just collapsing, it's fleeing. As violence shook the streets, another collapse was unfolding behind locked vault doors. The Central Bank of Iran was bleeding out, and nobody was supposed to know. It started with the fall of Ayande Bank, one of Iran's largest so-called private financial institutions. On paper, it was independent. In reality, it was a laundering hub for the regime's elite and the Revolutionary Guard. When protests exploded across the country, Ayande's books were opened, and what emerged wasn't a banking failure. It was a crime scene. Over $5.2 billion in public deposits had vanished, not lost in bad investments, but funneled directly to 61 regime-connected individuals without collateral, without oversight. Investigators discovered that 98% of Ayande's loan portfolio was non-performing. That figure should never exceed 5% in a stable system. Instead, billions had been wired into hollow construction projects, front companies, and offshore real estate portfolios. Then the chain reaction began. The Central Bank of Iran issued an internal directive marked Emergency Protocol. It ordered all national banks to switch to disaster mode. Data backups were transferred, Cash reserves were physically relocated. Power systems were hardened against cyber attacks. But the real warning was buried deep in the document. Prepare alternative settlement infrastructure in the event of regime disruption. Translation: they weren't just protecting their systems. They were simulating their own collapse. Across Tehran, ATMs stopped dispensing cash. Businesses were forced to shut down after bank transfers failed. Markets froze. The Grand Bazaar closed. And the rial collapsed to its lowest value in recorded history. Iran's economy had been hollowed out from within, not by foreign sanctions, but by internal betrayal. And as people buried their loved ones in silence, they discovered something just as terrifying as military violence. The money was gone, not stolen by outsiders, stolen by the regime itself. China and Russia didn't release statements. They didn't condemn the killings, but they spoke in the only language that matters in geopolitical collapse: silent withdrawal. While Iran's regime tried to project strength on state television, its two most powerful allies began executing quiet, deliberate moves that revealed what they truly believed. The first signal came from China. Beijing, which purchases the vast majority of Iran's oil and has used the Islamic Republic as a key node in its Belt and Road Initiative, suddenly froze multiple pending payments. $6 billion in expected oil revenue was withheld. Tankers were left idle at sea, anchored near the port of Bushehr, with no clearance to load or offload. Chinese state banks began pulling out of contracts. There was no explanation. Only silence and blocked transactions. At the same time, Russian behavior shifted drastically. As the Revolutionary Guard's violence escalated, Russian officials stopped answering back-channel requests from Tehran for diplomatic support. And then came the turning point. Russian migration offices began rejecting asylum requests from mid-level Iranian officials and military officers. Only the top tier, the supreme leader's inner circle, were being quietly accepted. In intelligence terms, this is a red flag. Moscow was trimming fat, preparing for limited intake, prioritizing leverage over loyalty. Behind closed doors, the Kremlin had seen what the world was beginning to understand. The Iranian regime was bleeding legitimacy faster than it could suppress revolt, and Vladimir Putin, already overstretched in Ukraine, could not afford to tie Russia's survival to a sinking ally. Then Trump spoke. Khamenei is running out of time, and his friends know it. That wasn't a guess. It was a reference to intercepted communications between Russian military attachés and Iranian diplomats, acknowledging that the window for survival was closing. No statements, no solidarity, just quiet disengagement. Because when even your closest partners start pulling their money, blocking your officials, and denying your last-minute escape plans, they haven't betrayed you. They've just accepted you're already gone. For 72 hours, the world watched in horror as over 12,000 civilians were massacred across Iran. Footage leaked through Starlink satellites. Medical reports surfaced from inside blackout zones. Intelligence confirmed who gave the order. And while global leaders issued cautious statements, Donald Trump did something different. He moved. It began with a message, not through a press secretary or a podium, but directly from Trump himself. The names are being written down. They will pay. Help is already in the air. It wasn't metaphor. It was preparation. By the time that message went live, U.S. bombers were already airborne, repositioned across the Gulf, held just outside Iranian radar range. But the strike wasn't immediate. Trump wasn't just reacting. He was calculating. Behind the scenes, a high-level war council was convened at Mar-a-Lago. Former military advisors, CENTCOM intelligence liaisons, and Middle East analysts were flown in. The question wasn't whether to intervene. It was how hard, how fast, and how precise. Then came the order: limited kinetic retaliation, Within 24 hours, multiple regime-linked infrastructure sites were hit with pinpoint precision: communication towers in Qom, logistics warehouses outside Esfahan, a black site known to house surveillance drones. There were no civilian casualties, no collateral damage, just silence, followed by shock. Iranian media tried to spin it as routine explosions, but within military circles, the message was clear. We saw what you did. We know who gave the order. And this is just the beginning. The ripple effect was immediate. Regime commanders began relocating families. Hezbollah units were placed on alert. Chinese and Russian envoys requested emergency briefings. Because this wasn't the 2003 Iraq War. This wasn't full-scale invasion. It was something far more terrifying to authoritarian regimes. A surgical demonstration of force, backed by real-time intelligence, and directed at decision-makers, not cities. Trump didn't need to send troops. He didn't need to topple a government. He simply proved he could strike anywhere, at any time, and no regime was beyond reach. And in that moment, across Tehran, Beijing, and Moscow, the world changed. What you've just heard isn't prediction or dramatization. It's a record of events, confirmed and unfolding in real time. 12,000 lives were taken. Not in secret, not by accident, but by order. And in response, the world's most unpredictable president didn't blink. He acted. Quietly. Precisely. And the ripple of that decision is still spreading through the Middle East, through global alliances, and through every regime that thought it could outlast its own people. Iran isn't just a headline, it's a warning. To those who think they can steal, kill, and escape unnoticed, there's no longer a place to hide. And to those watching from the outside, wondering whether justice still matters in a world ruled by force, what happened in Iran was the answer. This was a massacre. This was a betrayal. And this was the moment it turned. I'm William Chen. Thank you for watching. Stay informed.